cold wind howled over the rocky Oregon coastline. October waves crashed against the rocks with terrifying force. It was the night Detective Patricia Reynolds disappeared. Her last radio message was cut short. The world held its breath. 1976. Late autumn brought unusually strong storms to the Oregon coast. The wind howled, the rain beat down, and the Pacific Ocean waves crashed against the shore with a roar that could drown out any scream. It was in these harsh conditions that a story unfolded that would become one of the region's darkest mysteries for many years. Detective Patricia Reynolds, 32 years old, was a woman of rare determination. Her career with the Portland Police Department was marked by a series of successful investigations. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She wasn't afraid of being alone. For the past 2 years, Patricia had been working on a case involving a series of mysterious disappearances. 5 people with no apparent connection to each other had simply vanished without a trace. A teacher, a nurse, 2 fishermen, and a teenager. Each of them had disappeared within a few miles of this windswept coastline. Locals whispered about ancient curses, sea ghosts, and invisible forces. Patricia, however, was looking for a rational explanation. She was convinced that all the disappearances were connected. She felt she was getting closer to solving the puzzle. Her colleagues often joked about her obsession with the case. For Patricia, it wasn't a joke. It was her mission. On that fateful evening, October 23, 1976, Patricia was once again on the coast. She had received an anonymous call that pointed to a system of sea caves south of the town. This area was known for its dangerous tides and hidden grottos. Even experienced fishermen avoided it in stormy weather. But Patricia couldn't wait. She felt that time was running out. She left her car on a cliff, reporting her location by radio. Her last transmission was at 10:47 p.m. Her voice was tense but determined. She said something about finding something. She said she was going to check the caves. Then there was complete silence. The radio operator tried to contact her, but there was no answer. Only static. The police mobilized all their forces. The search began immediately. Helicopters, boats, divers. They combed every square inch of the coastline. The storm complicated the search, but they didn't give up. Every officer knew Patricia. She was one of the best. They found only her broken flashlight on a steep path leading to the shore. The flashlight was shattered. It seemed as if someone had deliberately broken it, or she had fallen. There were no other traces, no clues. Patricia Reynolds, a detective, had become the 6th victim of the mysterious disappearances. Her case was closed. Several months later, she was officially declared dead. The mystery remained unsolved. Grief gripped her family. The world continued to turn. Years passed, then decades, and then another 5 years. The mystery of the disappearance of Detective Reynolds and the other 5 people gradually faded into the past. It became a local legend, a scary tale told around the campfire on windy nights. For Patricia's family, for her husband and young daughter, it was a nightmare that never ended. Patricia's husband, devastated by grief, eventually remarried. He tried to move on. Patricia's daughter grew up. She barely remembered her mother. Memories of her were vague. The officers who had worked with Patricia still sometimes remembered her persistence. They felt that something was wrong, but no new clues emerged. The case remained closed. The truth, however, hadn't disappeared. It was hidden deep beneath the surface, in a labyrinth of sea caves that few people knew existed. Robert Blackwood, 45 years old, a former naval medic, was a man whose life had been shattered by war. The horrors he had seen had traumatized his mind. He developed a psychosis in which he believed he was protecting people from the corrupt world above. He believed that only he could save souls from modern civilization. He saw himself as a kind of savior. His worldview became his own reality. Blackwood had discovered an extensive system of interconnected sea caves during one of his walks. He was a self-taught engineer and possessed extraordinary planning abilities. For several years, he had been turning these caves into his personal underground prison. He installed hidden doors, built ventilation shafts, and equipped cells for his wards. He was very careful. No one suspected his activities. He was known as a withdrawn but harmless man. He bought supplies in remote stores so as not to arouse suspicion. He worked alone. His madness grew in complete isolation. Patricia Reynolds was close to unlocking his secret. She had spent weeks studying a map of the coastline, analyzing the locations of each disappearance. She had noticed a strange pattern that pointed to this particular stretch of coast. When she went down into the caves that stormy night, Blackwood was waiting for her. He knew the police were getting closer. He was ready. He attacked her from ambush. But unlike his other victims, Blackwood was fascinated by Patricia. Her strength, her intelligence, her unwavering determination impressed him. He saw her as a potential ally, a soul that could be saved. This changed everything for him. He kept her separate from the others, in a special cell that he called the observation room. It was a small room overlooking the main grotto. He tried to convince her of his twisted version of salvation. He spoke to her for hours, explaining his philosophy. Patricia pretended to listen. In reality, she was planning her escape. She survived in this underwater labyrinth for 15 years. During low tides, when the water level dropped, she had access to air pockets and small inland beaches. Blackwood kept supplies there. He brought food, water, and medicine. He wanted his wards to be healthy. His care was perverse. Patricia found the other 5 prisoners. They were alive but psychologically shattered. Years of isolation, fear, and brainwashing had turned them into shadows of their former selves. They barely spoke. Patricia tried to organize them. She whispered to them about escape, about freedom. She tried to find a way out, but the treacherous tides and the complex structure of the caves made it impossible. She drew maps on the walls with charcoal she found in the caves. She marked routes, currents, and air pockets. She didn't give up. She was their only hope. Her spirit remained unbroken. With each passing day, Patricia became more and more resourceful. She studied the rhythm of the tides. She memorized every crack in the rock, every sound. She looked for weaknesses in Blackwood's system. She watched him, his habits, his mood swings. She understood that her survival depended on her ability to think like a detective. Even in the most desperate conditions, the other prisoners looked up to her with awe. She was their leader, their protector. She created a routine for them, taught them how to stay sane, told them stories about the outside world, about what it was like before their confinement. Blackwood sometimes talked to her about his plans, about his vision of a new world. He wanted her to join him, to become his partner. Patricia pretended to consider his proposals. She asked him questions to learn more about his beliefs, about his past. She used this information to better understand him, to find his vulnerabilities. She knew that one day she would have a chance, and when that chance came, she would be ready. Her mind was her only weapon. She honed it every day. In 1991, 15 years after Patricia Reynolds disappeared, fate, or perhaps just coincidence, decided to reveal this long-standing mystery. Miguel Santos, a 40-year-old fisherman, was a man of the sea. He knew every rock, every wave on this coast. That day, there was an exceptionally low tide. It was one of the strongest low tides he had remembered in his life. The water level dropped so low that it revealed new sections of the coastline that were usually hidden. Miguel decided to explore this new territory. He was always looking for new places to fish. He sailed in his small boat, examining the rocky formations. Suddenly, he heard voices. They were weak, muffled, but distinct. The voices were coming from under the rocks. His heart began to beat faster. He thought they might be tourists in trouble. He carefully steered his boat towards the source of the sound. He found a narrow crevice in the rock that was usually completely covered with water. Now it was open. He tied up his boat and carefully made his way inside. The air inside was heavy, damp, and smelled of salt and something else, something musty. Miguel followed the sound. The crevice led him to a huge grotto. What he saw was impossible. Inside the grotto, in primitive conditions, lived 6 skeletal people. They were thin, their skin was pale, their hair was long and matted. They looked like ghosts. Miguel stood stunned, unable to believe his eyes. One of the women, despite her emaciated appearance, approached him. Her eyes burned with an extraordinary fire. She spoke calmly, but her voice trembled with excitement. She immediately introduced herself. She said her name was Detective Patricia Reynolds. Badge number 4827. Miguel Santos was shocked. He had heard the story of the missing woman, the detective. He had never believed it. He thought it was just an urban legend. But now he was looking at her, at a living person. He could barely speak. Patricia Reynolds quickly explained to him what had happened. She told him about the other prisoners, about Blackwood. She spoke very quickly, as if afraid he would disappear. Miguel knew he had to act fast. The tide could return at any moment. He promised her that he would return. He promised her rescue. He felt the weight of her words. Miguel carefully climbed out of the cave. His mind was in turmoil. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. He quickly headed to shore to report his incredible discovery. He needed to contact the Coast Guard, the police, anyone who could help. He knew that every minute counted. The lives of these people were hanging by a thread. He was just a fisherman, but now an incredible responsibility lay on his shoulders. He had to become their savior. The rescue operation was incredibly complex. The Coast Guard had to wait for the perfect low tide to safely reach the caves. They used specialized equipment: divers, medics, rescuers. Information about Miguel Santos's discovery spread quickly. The media flocked to the coast. The world waited. Finally, after several hours of intense work, the prisoners were extracted from the caves. They were greeted by a stunned crowd. When they emerged into the light, the world was in shock. No one could believe their eyes. Patricia Reynolds, now 47 years old, looked exhausted, but her eyes were full of determination. She had been able to keep detailed records on the walls of the caves using charcoal. These weren't just records. They were carefully drawn maps and diaries containing information about Blackwood, his methods, and his motives. These records became crucial evidence. Robert Blackwood, her abductor, had died 3 years earlier in a rock-climbing accident. His secret would have died with him if it hadn't been for Patricia's incredible endurance. She was a living witness to his crimes. The remaining 5 survivors were the original missing people: the teacher, the nurse, the 2 fishermen, and the runaway teenager. Now they were traumatized adults who barely remembered their former lives. Years of confinement and psychological abuse had left deep scars. They were disoriented. They were frightened. But Patricia had become their leader and protector. She supported their mental health by establishing a routine, reading them books that Blackwood sometimes brought, and giving them hope. She was their beacon in the pitch-black darkness. She was their only link to the outside world. The information about Blackwood was shocking. He was a war veteran, a mentally ill man who believed in his twisted mission. He used his knowledge of medicine and engineering to create his prison. He brainwashed his prisoners, trying to convince them that the outside world was corrupt, that they were safe in his caves. But Patricia never gave up. She was strong, she was smart, she was a detective. She collected evidence, she documented every day. She planned her escape, even when it seemed impossible. She was a living witness to his crimes. The public was stunned by this story. People couldn't believe that something like this could have happened in their own state. The story of 6 missing people who had been alive all these years, locked underground. It was a story of horror and incredible endurance. A story of how one woman, despite all the obstacles, had kept her sanity and her will to live. It was a story of hope in the darkest conditions. News headlines screamed about the event. After the initial emotions subsided, a long and difficult process began. The survivors needed medical care and psychiatric support. Patricia, despite her own exhaustion, continued to display incredible strength of spirit. She cooperated with the authorities, providing all the details she remembered. She spoke about the location of each cell, about Blackwood's supplies, about his habits. Her testimony was invaluable in understanding the scope of his crimes. Experts examined the caves. They were amazed by the engineering complexity with which Blackwood had transformed the natural labyrinth. Hidden passages, water drainage systems, storage areas. He wasn't just crazy. He was a calculating and extremely dangerous man. Police found traces of other, earlier unsuccessful attempts by Blackwood to capture people. Fortunately, those attempts hadn't been successful. It was pure luck that Patricia and the others turned out to be his only long-term victims. The memories of the survivors, although fragmented, confirmed Patricia's words. They barely remembered their names, their families, but they remembered her. Patricia was their support, their voice. The teacher named Sarah was now a fragile woman who spoke in a whisper. The nurse, Emily, often cried as she looked at the bright sunlight. The fishermen, George and Thomas, were silent and sullen. The teenager, whose name was Dan, was now an adult man, but he was still afraid of the dark. Patricia spoke about the escape attempts, about how they had almost gotten out once, but the treacherous tide had forced them to return, about how she had kept their spirits up by telling them stories, reading them excerpts from old books that Blackwood had accidentally left behind. She even managed to hold math lessons for them using pebbles and sand. She created a kind of underground school to preserve their minds, to keep them from breaking down completely. Her resourcefulness was astounding. The families of the survivors were called in for identification. These were heartbreaking meetings. Sarah's husband cried as he embraced his wife, whom he had considered dead for almost 15 years. Dan's parents couldn't believe that their son was alive. They were shocked by his appearance. These reunions were bittersweet. The joy of them being alive was mixed with the pain of what they had been through. It was a new chapter in their lives, a chapter full of uncertainty. The reintegration of the survivors into society was brutal. Patricia discovered that she had been officially declared dead. Her husband, having experienced profound grief, had found new love and remarried. This was Alex, the man who had supported him in the darkest times. It was painful for Patricia. Her daughter, who had been only 7 years old when Patricia disappeared, was now a teenager. She was 22 years old. She didn't recognize her mother. It was incredibly painful for Patricia. Everything she knew, everything she had changed. The world had continued to move forward without her. But Patricia was indomitable. She was a detective. She was used to hardship. She was persistent in pursuing her goals. After long months of rehabilitation, she returned to the police force not as a regular detective, but as a consultant specializing in long-term confinement cases. Her unique experience was invaluable. She helped other victims of long-term isolation, understanding their trauma like no one else. She became a voice for those who couldn't speak. Her story became a lesson for everyone working in law enforcement, a lesson about checking every detail, a lesson about miracles happening. The other survivors, however, couldn't adapt so easily. The teacher Sarah and the nurse Emily, who had been Blackwood's first victims, were the most severely traumatized. They lived in constant fear. They needed constant psychological help. They often recalled nightmares from the caves. The two fishermen, George and Thomas, were able to return to their former lives, but they were withdrawn and avoided people. They spent most of their time alone. The teenager whose name was Dan had disappeared at 16 years old. Now he was an adult man, but he was still afraid of the dark. He was never able to fully recover. They were living reminders of the cruelty that human beings were capable of. The sea caves that had become a prison for these people were sealed with concrete. No one else should enter there. No one else should experience such horror. It was a final farewell to a dark past. It was a symbol of the end of a nightmare. Workers spent several weeks filling every entrance, every grotto with a thick layer of concrete. The sound of the machines was the last echo of human intervention in this natural hell. Now the place was a silent grave. Blackwood's story remained a mystery to many. What exactly had driven him to such madness? Psychiatrists tried to analyze him posthumously, based on Patricia's testimony and his records. They concluded that it was an extremely severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder, exacerbated by isolation and delusional ideas. He was a product of war, but his actions were his own choice, and he should have been held accountable for them if he had remained alive. Society reacted to the story in different ways. First, there was shock, then horror, and then deep sympathy for the victims. Foundations were established to support the survivors. Psychological assistance was provided free of charge. It was a huge step forward for society in understanding the trauma associated with long-term confinement. Patricia Reynolds' story became a symbol of hope and endurance, a symbol that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can endure. Patricia used her new role as a consultant to change approaches to disappearance investigations. She insisted on more thorough checks of hard-to-reach places, on considering the mental health of potential offenders, and on training officers how to recognize the signs of prolonged detention. Her experience was bitter but invaluable. She became a voice for those who were lost, for those who were waiting to be rescued. She was a driving force for change in the law enforcement system. Her personal life remained complex. Rebuilding her relationship with her daughter, Sarah, was the biggest challenge. Sarah was initially alienated. She only knew Patricia from photographs, from stories. Now there was a living woman in front of her who claimed to be her mother. It was difficult to accept, but Patricia was patient. She told Sarah about her years in the cave, about her dreams of her daughter, about how she held on to the thought of her. Slowly, step by step, they began to build a new connection, a connection based on understanding and love. Patricia's husband, Michael, and his new wife, Emma, also faced difficulties. Michael felt guilt, relief, and complex emotions. Emma was compassionate. She understood that Patricia was part of Michael's past. They all attended family therapy sessions together. It wasn't easy, but they strived for peace, for understanding, for a normal life. Their story became a lesson about how tragedy can forever change lives, but also about how people can adapt and find new meaning. The story of the 6 missing people became part of Oregon folklore. Locals often mentioned it, about how the caves had been silent for 15 years, about how the sea had kept a terrible secret. It was a story that would forever remain in the memory of generations, a reminder of the fragility of human life and the incredible strength of the human spirit. Life after the revelation was difficult, but Patricia Reynolds found her way. She became a symbol of incredible endurance and the human spirit. Her story inspired many. She continued to work, helping others, and found meaning in it. She was able to rebuild her relationship with her daughter. It was a long and difficult process, but they were able to find common ground. They began to build a new future. But even years later, Patricia still woke up at night. She heard the sound of waves, echoing in the stone chambers. She remembered the 15 years when the ocean was both her prison and her salvation. She remembered every day, every night spent in the dark. These memories were part of her. They had made her who she had become. Patricia Reynolds' story became a reminder that even in the most desperate circumstances, the human spirit can endure. It was a story about hope, about struggle, and about the indomitable will to live, a story that would never be forgotten. Now working as a consultant, Patricia often visited places where similar disappearances had occurred. She shared her experience with the families of the missing. She gave them hope. She told them to never give up, that the truth might be hidden, but it would always find a way to come to light. She was living proof of this, and her words carried enormous weight. Her voice was the voice of a survivor. She sometimes visited Sarah, Emily, George, Thomas, and Dan. They were still struggling, but they were struggling together. They were bound by their shared trauma, by their shared history. Patricia was their family, their link, and she would always be there for them. Her strength inspired them. Her presence comforted them. At sunset, when the sun dipped below the horizon of the Pacific Ocean, Patricia often stood on the same cliff where she had once disappeared. She watched the waves. She listened to the wind. She felt the presence of the past. But now it wasn't a feeling of fear. It was a feeling of survival, a feeling of triumph. Her story was over, but her influence continued, and she knew that her life, filled with pain and resilience, had meaning. She was a detective. She was a survivor. She was Patricia Reynolds.